Working the late shift at Walmart wasn't the most exciting job in the world, but it paid the bills. I'd been there for about 6 months, mostly doing stock work and manning the registers when things got busy. The overnight hours had their perks. It was quieter, no screaming kids or endless lines of customers. But it also had its downsides, especially on nights like this. It was a little after midnight, and the store was almost empty. The rain outside was relentless, hammering against the roof and sliding down the wide glass windows near the entrance. The hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional crackle of the intercom were the only sounds inside. I was stocking shelves in the back aisle, near the outdoor and camping gear, when I first noticed it. A cart was sitting there, unattended, parked haphazardly in the middle of the aisle. It was loaded with random items: flashlights, rope, a tarp, even a couple of butcher knives from the kitchen section. Nothing was unusual about customers abandoning carts, but something about this one felt off. The items didn't seem like things someone would buy together unless they had a specific plan in mind. I shrugged it off and pushed the cart to the side, figuring someone would come back for it. The rain had picked up outside, the sound growing louder, almost drowning out the faint music playing over the store speakers. I went back to my work, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. About 10 minutes later, I noticed the cart again. It was at the end of the aisle, facing me this time, even though I hadn't seen or heard anyone move it. The same items were still inside, arranged just as they had been before. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing faintly in the empty aisle. "Is someone there?" Silence. Just the rain and the low hum of the store. I walked toward the cart slowly, scanning the area. The security cameras above blinked their red lights, reassuring me I wasn't entirely alone. Still, the store felt too quiet, the air too heavy. I grabbed the cart and pushed it back toward the front, parking it near the customer service desk before heading back to my section. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling sound, coming from the next aisle over. My first thought was that it was another employee. Jackie, one of the overnight stockers, was supposed to be working the grocery section, but she had a habit of wandering off. I grabbed my walkie and pressed the button. "Jackie, you in the camping aisle?" I asked. There was no response. Just static. I frowned and stepped around the corner, shining my flashlight down the aisle. It was empty, rows of neatly stocked tents and sleeping bags staring back at me. The rustling had stopped, but the silence was worse somehow. I turned to head back, but then I saw it. A single sleeping bag, unrolled and laid out in the middle of the floor. It hadn't been there before. I knelt down, my flashlight's beam catching the faint glint of something wet on the fabric. My stomach churned as I realized it wasn't water, it was blood. Not a lot, just a smear, like someone had wiped their hand across it. I stood up quickly, scanning the aisle again. My pulse was racing now, my breath coming in shallow bursts. "Jackie," I called out, louder this time. "If this is a joke, it's not funny." No answer. Just the rain. I backed away slowly, my footsteps echoing on the polished floor. As I turned the corner, I nearly ran into someone, a man, tall and thin, wearing a gray hoodie with the hood pulled low over his face. I stumbled back, my flashlight beam bouncing off his chest. "Sorry," I said instinctively, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, his hands buried in his hoodie pockets, his head tilted slightly like he was studying me. I couldn't see his face, just the faint shadow of a grin under the hood. My unease deepened as the silence stretched between us. "Can I help you with something?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The man didn't say anything. He just reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. He held it out to me, his hand trembling slightly. I hesitated before taking it, my fingers brushing against his cold, damp skin. The paper was torn from a notebook, the handwriting messy and jagged. It read, "You're not alone." When I looked up, he was gone. There was no sound, no footsteps, nothing. Just the empty aisle stretching out before me. I spun around, shining the flashlight in every direction, but the man had vanished. My heart pounded as I clutched the note, the words burned into my mind. I hurried back to the front of the store, my walkie clutched tightly in my hand. "Jackie. Steve. Anyone, do you copy?" I barked into it. Static. I reached the customer service desk, but it was empty. The cart I'd parked there earlier was gone, the floor slick with muddy footprints leading away from it. My stomach turned as I realized the footprints led back toward the camping section. I was about to call out again when the store's power flickered. The lights buzzed and dimmed, plunging the aisles into shadows before flickering back on. The intercom crackled to life, a burst of static followed by what sounded like faint breathing. Then a voice came through. Soft. Whispering. Run. The word echoed through the empty store, low and distorted, as if it were being spoken directly into my ear. My blood ran cold, and I froze, gripping the edge of the customer service desk for support. The intercom crackled again, the static hissing like a warning. I stared at the speaker overhead, half expecting the voice to return, but the store fell into an eerie silence. Even the rain seemed muffled now, like the world outside had disappeared. I didn't want to move, didn't want to make a sound, but I couldn't just stand there. Jackie. Steve? If this is a joke, it's not funny. I yelled, my voice shaky, the words bouncing off the empty aisles. No response. My eyes flicked to the footprints trailing away from the desk, muddy streaks leading back toward the camping section. I didn't want to follow them, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to. My instincts screamed at me to leave the store, to walk out into the rain and never look back, but my legs moved on their own. I followed the tracks, my flashlight beam cutting through the shadows. The store felt wrong now, the rows of shelves looming like walls in a maze. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, their usual hum now grating, oppressive. When I reached the camping aisle, the footprints stopped abruptly. I scanned the area, but it looked the same as before, rows of tents, sleeping bags, and outdoor gear neatly arranged. The unrolled sleeping bag was gone, though, and the faint smear of blood had been wiped clean, leaving only a damp spot on the floor. I turned to leave, my heart pounding, when a sound stopped me dead in my tracks. A zipper. It was faint, almost drowned out by the rain, but unmistakable. The sound of a tent zipper being drawn open. It came from the end of the aisle, where a display of fully assembled tents stood under a canopy of fake trees. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I pointed it toward the display. Hello. I called, my voice cracking. The zipper sound stopped. I took a step closer, my boots squeaking on the tile floor. The tent in the center of the display, a large green one meant for 6 people, swayed slightly, as if something inside had shifted. The flap hung open now, the darkness inside impenetrable. Jackie. Steve. I said again, this time barely above a whisper. The tent flap moved. Something inside crawled out, dragging itself into the aisle. At first, I thought it was a person, maybe Jackie playing a prank. But as the figure emerged, its movements were jerky, wrong. Its limbs were too long, its body hunched unnaturally. The flashlight beam caught its face, and my stomach churned. It wasn't a face at all. Just a blank, pale surface, like skin stretched too tightly over a misshapen skull. Where eyes and a mouth should have been, there was nothing. Just smooth, featureless flesh. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The thing turned its head toward me, its neck cracking like dry wood. It didn't move for a moment, just stared, or at least, I thought it did. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, it lunged. I screamed, throwing myself to the side. My shoulder slammed into the shelf, sending flashlights and lanterns crashing to the floor. The creature skittered past me, its limbs contorting unnaturally as it disappeared into the next aisle. My chest heaved as I scrambled to my feet, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. The intercom crackled to life again, a burst of static followed by the same distorted whisper. Run. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted toward the front of the store, my boots sliding on the wet floor. The aisles blurred past me, the shelves seeming to stretch endlessly in all directions. The air felt heavy, suffocating, like the store was closing in on me. When I reached the entrance, I slammed into the glass doors, only to find them locked. The rain pounded against the glass, the outside world tantalizingly close but unreachable. I pounded on the door, yelling for help, but the parking lot was empty. Behind me, I heard the skittering again. I turned, my flashlight catching glimpses of movement in the shadows. The creature was back, its long limbs bending at impossible angles as it crawled toward me. Its blank face tilted upward, and I swear I could feel it watching me, even without eyes. I grabbed a nearby display rack, a tower of umbrellas, and shoved it into its path. The creature slammed into the rack, umbrellas clattering to the floor. I didn't wait to see if it would recover. I turned and ran toward the employee break room, the only place in the store with a door I could lock. The break room was small and cluttered, with a couple of vending machines and a table stacked with old newspapers. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it and bracing myself against it. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, the adrenaline making my hands shake. For a moment, there was silence. Then the skittering started again, closer now. It stopped just outside the door. I pressed my ear to the wood, straining to hear. At first, there was nothing. Then, a soft, wet scraping sound, like nails dragging down the other side. The intercom crackled one last time. "You shouldn't have stayed." The door creaked as something pressed against it, the wood bowing under the weight. I backed away, looking for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on a fire extinguisher near the vending machines, and I grabbed it, holding it like a bat. The door burst open. The last thing I saw before the flashlight flickered out was the creature's face, or lack of one, looming toward me, its featureless head twisting unnaturally. And then, everything went dark. When I woke up, it was morning. The store was bright and bustling with customers, the rain long gone. I was lying on the floor of the camping aisle, surrounded by scattered tents and flashlights. There was no sign of the creature, no blood, no muddy footprints. The manager found me and demanded an explanation, but I couldn't give him one. All I could do was mumble an excuse about slipping and hitting my head. But as I left the store, shaken and disoriented, I noticed something in my pocket. A crumpled piece of paper, written in jagged handwriting. "You're not alone." It was one of those nights where I really didn't want to leave the house. The rain was coming down hard, the kind of storm that makes the world outside look blurry and surreal. But my girlfriend, Claire, had asked me to grab a few things from Walmart on my way home from work. Milk, bread, and one of those overpriced candles she swears make the place feel cozy. I sighed, pulled into the parking lot, and trudged inside. Walmart after midnight is its own world. The place was practically deserted, just a few stragglers wandering the aisles, and a couple of employees lazily restocking shelves. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, and the faint hum of the overhead speakers played some nondescript pop song from years ago. The rain outside rattled against the building, muffled but persistent. I grabbed a cart and made my way through the aisles, the wheels squeaking loudly against the polished floor. It was supposed to be a quick trip. I knew exactly where everything was, or at least I thought I did. But something about the store felt different that night. The layout seemed wrong, like the aisles weren't where they were supposed to be. I chalked it up to fatigue and kept going. The first weird thing happened near the electronics section. As I passed the rows of TVs, all of them flickered at the same time. For a brief second, the screens went dark, and then something flashed across them, a face, pale and distorted, its eyes too wide, its mouth stretched into a silent scream. It was gone in an instant, replaced by the usual loop of ads and muted sports highlights. I stopped in my tracks, staring at the TVs. No one else seemed to notice. A stock boy wheeled past me with a pallet of DVDs, not even glancing at the screens. I shook my head and kept moving, my hands gripping the cart a little tighter. The store felt colder as I walked further in. The temperature drop wasn't sudden, but gradual, like someone had slowly turned down the thermostat. By the time I reached the grocery section, I could see my breath fogging up in the air. I glanced around, expecting to see one of those industrial freezers malfunctioning, but everything looked normal. That's when I noticed the aisle. It was off to the side, unmarked, and not part of the usual layout. The shelves were taller than the others, casting deep shadows across the floor. The fluorescent lights above it flickered faintly, casting a sickly yellow glow. At first, I thought it was a new section they'd added, maybe seasonal stuff or overstock. But the closer I got, the stranger it looked. The shelves weren't filled with regular Walmart merchandise. Instead, they were lined with odd, mismatched items. Old, dusty clocks. Faded photographs in cracked frames. Toys that looked decades old, their paint peeling and their eyes lifeless. A single boot, scuffed and weathered, sat on the edge of one shelf, next to a ceramic doll with a chipped face. None of it made sense. It didn't even look like it belonged in a store, let alone Walmart. I pushed my cart forward cautiously, the squeaking wheels breaking the heavy silence. The further I went down the aisle, the more bizarre the items became. A rusted birdcage with no door. A bundle of yellowed newspapers tied with fraying twine. A jar filled with something dark and murky, the label worn away. I should have turned around, should have gone back to the normal part of the store. But something about the aisle drew me in, like it was pulling me forward. My stomach churned with unease, but I kept walking, unable to stop myself. Then I saw the mirror. It was sitting on the floor at the very end of the aisle, leaning against the back wall. Its frame was ornate, covered in intricate carvings that looked like they'd been done by hand. The glass was cloudy, like it hadn't been cleaned in years, but I could still make out my reflection, or at least, I thought it was my reflection. The man in the mirror looked like me, but there was something off about him. His expression didn't match mine. While I stared in confusion, his face twisted into a grin, wide and toothy, too wide to be natural. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The reflection didn't follow my movements. It just stood there, grinning, watching me. And then it raised a hand and pointed. Not at me, behind me. I spun around, the cart rattling as I let go of it. The aisle was empty, but I felt it then, a presence, heavy and suffocating, like someone was standing just inches away. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and my chest tightened. I didn't dare look back at the mirror. A sound broke the silence, a soft, wet tapping, like bare feet on a tile floor. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer. My heart hammered as I turned back toward the main part of the store, abandoning the cart entirely. But the aisle didn't end. No matter how far I ran, the shelves stretched on endlessly, the flickering lights above casting shifting shadows. The sound of footsteps followed me, keeping pace, always just out of sight. I shouted for help, my voice echoing uselessly in the vast emptiness. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I stumbled out of the aisle, gasping for air, and found myself back in the main part of the store. The bright lights and familiar shelves felt like a slap to the face after the suffocating darkness of that aisle. My abandoned cart was sitting where I'd left it, the milk and bread still inside. I grabbed the cart and headed for the checkout, my hands trembling. I didn't look back. I didn't even bother with the candle Claire wanted. All I wanted was to get out of there. As I reached the self-checkout, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. The aisle was gone. Just a blank wall where it had been. But the tapping sound started again, faint and rhythmic, following me all the way to the exit. The tapping followed me all the way to the automatic doors, faint but steady, like a heartbeat I couldn't shake. I pushed my cart through the exit as the cold night air hit me, the rain coming down harder than ever. For a moment, the sound was drowned out by the storm, and I felt a wave of relief. Whatever had happened inside, I was out now. I was safe. But then I saw the parking lot. It should have been familiar, a sprawling grid of rows and rows of cars, but something was wrong. The lights were dimmer than they'd been when I arrived, their sickly yellow glow casting long, distorted shadows. The rain pooled in unnaturally large puddles, their surfaces rippling even though there was no wind. And the cars, they were wrong. Their windows were too dark, their shapes indistinct, like they weren't really there. I told myself I was just imagining it, that the weirdness of the aisle was messing with my head. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. As I wheeled my cart toward my truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The tapping had stopped, but the silence was worse somehow. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing behind me. The parking lot was empty. At least, I thought it was. When I looked closer, I noticed something, or someone, standing in the far corner of the lot, near the edge of the light. It was a figure, tall and still, just barely visible in the rain. I stopped walking, gripping the cart tightly, and stared. They didn't move, didn't come closer. They just stood there, watching. I shook my head, trying to snap myself out of it. Maybe it was another customer or one of the night employees. But why were they just standing there in the rain? I quickened my pace, the cart rattling loudly as I reached my truck. I threw the groceries into the passenger seat and climbed in, locking the doors. The engine roared to life, and the headlights cut through the rain, illuminating the empty rows of cars ahead. Except they weren't empty anymore. The figure was closer now, standing directly in my headlights. My breath caught in my throat as I got a better look at them. It was a man, or at least, it looked like one. He was wearing a suit, but it was soaked, clinging to his unnaturally thin frame. His head was tilted to one side, his face obscured by the rain. I flicked the high beams on, and the light hit his face. I wish it hadn't. His skin was pale and smooth, too smooth, like it had been stretched over his skull. His eyes were wide and black, bottomless pits that seemed to suck in the light. And his mouth, God, his mouth. It was too large, the corners stretching up into a twisted, unnatural grin that didn't belong on any human face. He raised one hand and pointed at me. I slammed the truck into reverse, my tires screeching against the wet pavement as I backed out of the space. The figure didn't move, didn't react. He just stood there, grinning, his hand still outstretched. My heart was pounding as I shifted into drive and tore out of the parking lot, the rain blurring everything around me. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Somehow, I knew he was still there, watching. The drive home was a blur. The rain made the roads nearly impossible to navigate, and my hands shook so badly I could barely keep the truck steady. Every shadow, every flicker of light in the corner of my vision, made my chest tighten. I kept expecting to see him in the rearview mirror, sitting in the back seat with that awful grin. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I felt a small surge of relief. My house was dark but familiar, a beacon of safety after the nightmare at Walmart. I grabbed the groceries and bolted for the front door, not even bothering to lock the truck behind me. Inside, I flicked on every light in the house. The warm glow of the living room lamps helped calm me down, and I sank onto the couch, trying to catch my breath. The groceries were still in the bag on the floor, forgotten for the moment. I told myself it was over. Whatever had happened at Walmart, it was done. Maybe I was overtired, or maybe the storm had played tricks on my mind. But as the minutes ticked by, that sense of unease crept back in. The tapping started again. It was faint, barely audible over the rain still pounding on the roof. At first, I thought it was just the storm, but it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It was coming from the window. I turned slowly, my heart racing. The curtains were drawn, but the tapping grew louder, more insistent. I didn't want to look, didn't want to see what was outside. But I couldn't help myself. I reached for the curtain and pulled it back. He was there. Standing just outside the window, his suit still dripping, his grin wider than ever. His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a cold dread wash over me, rooting me to the spot. He raised a hand, his long fingers pressing against the glass, and leaned closer. Then he mouthed a single word. Mine. The lights in the house flickered, and the room plunged into darkness. I stumbled back, my breath coming in panicked gasps. When the lights came back on, the window was empty. He was gone. But the tapping started again. This time, it was coming from the front door. It was supposed to be a quick trip, just grab a couple of things and get out. I'd spent the whole day fixing the gutters on my house, and by the time I realized I was out of coffee and dog food, it was already past 10. The only place open that late was Walmart. I didn't love going there at night. The place had a way of feeling different after hours. But I didn't have much of a choice. The rain had started just as I pulled into the parking lot. Fat, heavy drops that pelted the windshield and turned the world into a blur. Most of the lot was empty, save for a few scattered cars and a couple of trucks parked at awkward angles. Typical for a late-night crowd. I grabbed a cart and made my way inside, shaking off the rain. The automatic doors whooshed shut behind me, sealing out the storm. The fluorescent lights were harsh after the dark drive, and the faint smell of floor cleaner lingered in the air. A couple of employees were chatting near the registers, their voices low, almost conspiratorial. One of them gave me a nod, but neither seemed interested in helping. The place was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that settles after a long day. Most of the aisles were empty, save for a few stragglers wandering aimlessly. I made my way to the coffee aisle first, grabbed a can of the cheap stuff, and tossed it into the cart. Then I headed toward the pet section for the dog food. That's when things started to feel off. It was subtle at first, just a weird sense that I wasn't as alone as I thought. The kind of feeling you get when someone's watching you, even though no one's there. The overhead speakers were playing some soft, tinny music, but the longer I listened, the less it sounded like music. It was faint, almost hidden under the hum of the lights, but it sounded more like whispering. I told myself I was imagining it. Long day, weird vibes. Nothing more. The pet aisle was completely empty when I got there. Rows of bags stacked neatly on the shelves, the faint smell of kibble in the air. I grabbed the usual brand, a massive bag that barely fit in the cart, and turned to leave. That's when I heard the noise. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone drumming their fingers on the shelves. I froze, listening. It wasn't coming from my aisle, but the one next to it. Slow and deliberate, tap tap tap, moving closer. "Hello," I called out, trying to sound casual. "Someone there?" The tapping stopped. I stood there for a moment, waiting, but all I heard was the faint whispering from the speakers. Shaking my head, I pushed the cart toward the front of the store. I was done. No more wandering, no more wasting time. I just wanted to pay and leave. As I passed aisle 13, though, something caught my eye. A single cart was parked in the middle of the aisle, completely still. It was loaded with random items, duct tape, a pack of disposable gloves, a gallon of bleach. Nothing too unusual, but the way it was left there, so perfectly aligned, made me pause. There wasn't anyone nearby, no movement, no sound. And then I noticed the shadow. It stretched out from the far end of the aisle, long and thin, bending unnaturally with the flickering light. It didn't match the shape of the shelves or the cart. It was a person, or at least, it looked like one. "Hey," I said, louder this time. "You need something?" The shadow didn't move. I took a step forward, peering down the aisle. The shadow stayed where it was, stretched out across the floor like it was frozen. But there was no one there to cast it. Just the cart, the shelves, and the flickering light. A chill ran down my spine. I backed away, pushing my cart faster now, heading straight for the registers. I wasn't going to stick around to figure out what was going on. When I got to the front, the two employees were gone. The registers were empty, the self-checkout machines blinking their idle screens. The store felt even quieter now, the whispering from the speakers almost deafening. As I scanned my items, I felt it again, that sensation of being watched. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the card reader, my eyes darting to the glass doors at the front of the store. The rain was still pouring outside, casting rippling shadows across the floor. That's when I saw the figure. It was standing just outside the doors, half hidden by the rain. Tall and thin, with a hood pulled low over its face. It didn't move, didn't try to come inside. It just stood there, staring. I grabbed my bags and bolted for the exit, the cart clattering as I shoved it aside. The automatic doors opened with a reluctant hiss, and I stepped out into the storm, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure was gone. But as I reached my truck, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A single, wet handprint on the driver's side window. I froze, staring at the handprint. The rain should have washed it away, but there it was, clear as day. It wasn't a normal handprint either. The fingers were too long, the palm too narrow, as if the hand that made it didn't quite belong to a human. Every instinct screamed at me to leave. Forget the groceries, forget everything, I just needed to get out of there. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped them. When I unlocked the truck and climbed in, I locked the doors immediately, throwing the bags onto the passenger seat. The interior of the truck felt small, claustrophobic. The rain hammered against the windshield, making it hard to see anything beyond the blurry glow of Walmart's parking lot lights. I stared at the handprint on the window, my breath fogging up the glass as I tried to calm down. Then, faintly, I heard it again. The tapping. It was coming from the back of the truck. I turned slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The truck bed was covered by a tarp, and for a moment, all I could see was the rain pooling on its surface. But then the tarp shifted, just slightly, as if something underneath it had moved. "Nope," I muttered, slamming the truck into reverse. The tires squealed against the wet pavement as I backed out of the parking space. I didn't even look behind me as I sped toward the exit, desperate to put as much distance as possible between me and that store. The tapping grew louder, faster, as if whatever was in the truck bed knew I was trying to escape. I didn't dare stop. The rain was blinding, the wipers struggling to keep up, but I pressed the gas harder, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. As I turned onto the main road, I caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror. A figure, thin and hunched, clinging to the edge of the truck bed. Its face was hidden by the rain, but I could see its hands gripping the tarp, those long, narrow fingers curling around the edges. "Get off!" I yelled, swerving the truck wildly. The movement threw the figure off balance, and for a brief moment, I thought I'd shaken it loose. But then a loud thud came from the roof of the cab, followed by the unmistakable sound of nails scraping against metal. I was out of options. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt on the slick road. The scraping stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, something slid down the windshield. It was the figure. Its face pressed against the glass, its empty, hollow eyes staring into mine. The rain distorted its features, but I could still see the twisted grin, too wide and too sharp to be human. It raised a hand and tapped on the glass, the sound slow and deliberate. Tap. 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 I screamed, slamming the gas pedal. The truck lurched forward, and the figure slid off the hood, disappearing under the wheels. I didn't stop to look, didn't care what happened to it. I just kept driving, my heart pounding in my ears. By the time I reached my driveway, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. My house looked like a beacon of safety, its warm lights glowing in the darkness. I parked the truck and sat there for a moment, trying to convince myself it was over. Whatever had happened, it was done. I was safe. I grabbed the groceries and made a run for the front door, my feet splashing through puddles. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like the storm wasn't quite finished with me yet. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, locking it behind me. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I set the bags on the counter and grabbed a towel to dry off, trying to shake the lingering unease. But as I reached for the milk, I noticed something strange. The groceries weren't the ones I'd picked up. The bag was filled with items from aisle 13. The duct tape. The gloves. The bleach. My stomach turned as I pulled each item out, my hands trembling. At the bottom of the bag was a small, crumpled piece of paper. I unfolded it, my breath catching in my throat as I read the words scrawled in jagged handwriting. "You can't leave." The lights flickered, and the tapping started again, this time, coming from the window behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I knew what I'd see.